Okay, welcome again, Professor Marcus Rediker. Our first question is, how in your career did you start to working with global history, and what defines it in your conception?
Okay, thank you, Marjorie. I should say in the beginning that this is a great project. I look forward to hearing what kind of responses you get from historians around the globe. I became an Atlantic historian / global historian in a somewhat unusual way. One part of it was accidental, and another part of it was quite deliberate. So when I, when I arrived to do graduate study in 1976, I was very interested to do what was called then and is still called history from below. And by that, I mean the kind of history of ordinary working people who are usually left out of the national narratives of the past. So I wasn't sure exactly how that would work out. My first impulse was to become a historian of slavery. I had grown up in the American South, and so the issues of race and slavery were very important to me, not least because of the power of the movements of that era, civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, but also other movements, the anti-war movement involving Vietnam. All of these movements were demanding different kinds of history, new kinds of history. The women's movement was another such example. So I want to do history from below, but I wasn't sure exactly what form that would take. I started following the work done by a group of historians in England under the direction of E.P. Thompson, author of The Making of the English Working Class, a book that I know is well known in Brazil. And Thompson and his students were using legal records to write history from below. And so I thought that was a good approach because those down below, the ordinary people, don't usually leave very many documents of their own. So finding legal records I thought was a good approach. So I decided that I would write my first seminar paper on pirates because I knew they had generated a massive amount of documentation. So I did that, I wrote that paper, and then I had to broaden that out to a history of working sailors in the first half of the 18th century. That became kind of a labor history. So once you're studying sailors, if you simply follow them wherever they go around the world, you become a global historian. So I followed sailors as they went from British and American ports to West Africa, to the East Indies, to Latin America, to the Caribbean, to the Mediterranean. And so in a very real sense, my experience of transnational history was built into the subject that I started to study. So that part of it was a bit accidental. The deliberate part is that I was very interested in the nature of class struggle across national boundaries. So in this sense, I had a set of questions about the origins and rise of capitalism, about the organization of labor, theoretical questions, really. And those questions I then applied to the working lives of sailors, their resistance, and all those sorts of issues. So in that sense, the questions that I posed were all quite deliberate. So I arrived at Atlantic or global history through a somewhat unusual route. That kind of history, to me, is defined by connections, the study of connections. We do have variants of global history that are primarily about comparisons. They're usually about national comparisons, and I think those are very useful. But what to my mind makes transnational history so exciting is that one looks for economic connections, social connections, political connections, cultural connections, intellectual connections, whatever it may be. And most important of all, in my view, is that these need to be human connections. So I'm very much in favor of a global human history.
Perfect, Professor. So here we go to our second question. What are the possibilities, in your opinion, for dialogue between the local and the global, the micro and the macro?
Okay, Marjorie, let me answer this question in a somewhat unusual way. The way I do history, the way I write history, the way I think about history, is very much informed by a storytelling tradition. And this is a storytelling tradition, a very important one within the United States. It's what's called Appalachian, which is a particular region in the United States. This tradition came to me through my grandfather, who was a coal miner in Kentucky. This is a bottom-up tradition of storytelling. My grandfather was a brilliant storyteller, and there are certain ways of telling stories that he always impressed upon me. And one of the points is this: he made clear that a really good storyteller always tells a big story within a little story. So I interpret this basically to mean that's the relationship between the micro and the macro. That's the relationship between the local and the global. So basically, what one does in telling a story is that you try to illuminate something that's quite specific, but you also try to illuminate something that's much bigger. And to draw an example from a project I'm working on right now, which is about escaping slavery by sea in 19th century America, a microhistory of one individual's effort to escape bondage can be linked to a much larger revolutionary overthrow of the institution of slavery, as long as the analyst makes the right connections. In other words, it's really up to the historian to draw out the linkages between the local and the global. So I'd say that these kinds of connections are not merely possible, they're really necessary. It's very important that we deal with the big themes of history in smaller stories. Questions like class formation, race formation, the rise of capitalism. These big themes have to be anchored in the lives of real people. And this, of course, is one of the premises of History from Below. I've always wanted to study real people taking real actions under real material circumstances, and to combat something that I've called the violence of abstraction. In other words, that sometimes we're too eager to dissolve the human subjects into various global structures, but we need that dynamic relationship between the particular and the general.
Perfect. So here we go to our third question. How to work with the multiple temporalities of global history, and if in your opinion, is there a short-term global history? Is it possible to do a short-term global history?
Well, here's what I would say about that. In terms of temporalities and the scales of history, to my mind, the single biggest challenge of Atlantic history and global history is keeping multiple contexts and chronologies in play at the same time. This is very hard to do because it requires that you be mindful of the way in which things that are happening in very different places are affecting the history that you're studying. To give just one example, the slave trade, as it's carried out by countries in Northwestern Europe, profoundly affects what happens in West Africa, as well as in the plantation societies of the Western Atlantic, places like the United States, Jamaica, Brazil. But the decisions are being made in places like London and Amsterdam and Madrid and Lisbon. So we need to keep in mind that these are different contexts, and that there are historical actors who are affecting the history that you're studying in different ways based on how you combine and link those multiple contexts and temporalities. And this, of course, was the big challenge in a book that I wrote with Peter Linebaugh called The Many-Headed Hydra, in which we tried to understand the linkages between European states, Northwest Europe, West Africa, North and South America, as well as the Caribbean, and crucially, on the histories of people on the ships that connected those regions. In other words, you've got to have the maritime element. That's really crucial. So I do think short world histories are possible. I think we all know from lecturing that sometimes you need something that is kind of short and synthetic and compressed. I think that can be a very useful kind of history. But I would also say that for the sake of scholarship, we probably need longer world histories that are really rooted in very complex and detailed ways in the localities that we also wish to study.
Okay. And Professor, does each type of research object, in your opinion, have the potential to become a global history?
I would say yes. I would say that any particular subject can be studied in global context and should be studied in global context. And here's the reason why. The very eminent late anthropologist Eric Wolf once made what I thought was a very powerful observation about how we do history, how we conceptualize and write history. He said, usually we do that by taking one part of history out of a larger global context, and then we study it. It might be the economic history of Brazil, or it might be the intellectual history of early America, and we study that, and we learn as much as we can about it. Wolf says, if at the end of that study, you don't go back and connect that part to the whole, you have then actually falsified the history. Because by taking something out of its fullest global context, you remove it in a way that facilitates investigation. But if you don't put it back together with the whole, the causality, for example, of involving whatever it is you're studying is probably not going to be fully understood. So I think that in a very real sense, we need always to reassemble the full global context around any study in order to prevent the falsification of history. I think understanding the breadth, the global breadth, is really crucial to understanding what happened, and maybe even more importantly, why it happened.
And our last question, but not least, what are the main risks and challenges in global history? Maybe if you want to share your criticisms about the field with us.
Sure. Well, I think one of the big challenges, and this is something that I've kind of worked on for a while, so forgive the self-interested nature of this comment. One of the big challenges is learning to think about the maritime spaces of the world as real historical places. Now, I think, having studied this for many years, that most people have an uninspected bias in which they assume that history happens on land and happens really only on land. And more specifically, most people assume that history happens in nation states. And in this view, oceans and seas are usually anti-spaces. They're not real spaces. And more importantly, they are historical voids. They're not places where real history happens. Yet, of course, we know that important historical processes, global historical processes, play out at sea, and we are blind to them. if we don't consider these maritime spaces as real. And I'll just give one example from this book I wrote called A Slave Ship, A Human History. The multi-ethnic peoples from West Africa who are loaded onto slave ships together and jammed into really small spaces in kind of brutal and inhumane conditions. Those people begin a process of cultural change, which will then carry over to traditions of resistance in the Americas. If you're not alert to what is happening on board ships, you're missing a crucial part of what is going to become these plantation societies of the New World. So we need to study these continuities across the water. So this critique is one in which I say our views of the past are frequently terra-centric, meaning land-based. And I think we really must take a more complex view of the maritime spaces of the world. I've already mentioned the problem of the challenge of multi-contextual history, that you need to keep multiple contexts in mind. I think this actually contains within it another risk, which is that basically there may be a tendency in global or Atlantic or transnational history to devalue research in local archives. I think this is a really important thing. We can lose the depth and the primacy and the importance of local history. And this is crucial because this is where people actually live. In other words, if we're going to get at the lived experience of people, we have to have that local context. So I worry that some variants of global history denature the past, oversimplify the past, thin out the past, and that they run the risk of dissolving the human subjects into a global system, into structure. Okay, I think structure is very important, but I think we also have to have, as I've said, these real human agents and subjects. We need to understand agency in relation to structure. And here's my last point. I think Atlantic history, transnational history, global history, I think these are very hard to do well. They're very easy to do poorly, but hard to do well. And the reason why is because this kind of history is, in my view, the most demanding of all in terms of the knowledge that the investigator needs in order to do everything properly. You need tremendous breadth of vision. That's the global sweep. But you also need tremendous depth, local knowledge, local depth. And in order to put these together, you really have to work hard. You have to study. You have to master many historical literatures. I do think this is happening, and I do think this is one of the most exciting developments in the discipline of history right now.
Absolutely, Professor. Thank you so much for your questions, for your inspiring talk this morning. And we will keep in touch to send you the link and also to share with you the other answers from the other professors we invited for this project. And thank you so much for giving us your time. Mm-hmm. It was a pleasure, a great pleasure too.
Likewise for me, Marjorie. I wish you all the best with this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Have a nice day.
You too.